All right, welcome back, those of you who are back. And we're on to our last session, and one that I'm very excited about, in the sense that throughout we've had a series of questions or discussions about the role of innovation and how that interacts with different kinds of health systems we've talked about, and more generally that innovation being a central question of how to design an efficient health system overall. So to answer that question once and for all, or at least pose some important issues and questions that we might think about, both in learning from different health systems and then in also helping design all of the health systems we're talking about here across countries. We have two fantastic speakers. First, we're going to have Matt Grennan talking about medical devices, and then Amitabh Chandra talking about drugs. But obviously, the more general questions of innovation will cut across all of those. We are going to take the same format we have been using at 20 minutes each, and I'll collect questions, and then we'll do questions for the both of you for the last 10 minutes after that. So then without further ado, let me turn the power over to Matt Grennan. Thank you.
Great, thanks, John. It's great to be a part of this. It's been a really interesting set of presentations. Fire up slides here. Okay. All right. So the topic I wanted to talk about today is one that's actually been in the news and maybe on the minds of the average person a lot more than it typically is, due to the current pandemic. And this is the background of this slide is just a New York Times headline from I think like 4 or 5 days ago, talking about how we may have a few vaccine approvals this spring, but there may be a lot of chaos and confusion after those occur due to the fact that there may not be a ton of evidence on the efficacy of those vaccines. And so our choice on whether to get vaccinated, the value of that, which vaccine to get if there's multiple, may not be a very informed one. And this is related to a tension that and of everyone who works in healthcare regulation, and then economists like me who like to think about these issues really focus in on, and that's this trade-off between access and risk, right? So it takes a long time to test products and large samples and long periods of time, and so the more we test, the longer we wait to get access to a new innovation, and the more we test, the more costly it is to introduce that product to the market, and so we may not have we may have products that don't even find it to be in their interest to enter at all if testing is too costly. And on the other side, more testing provides more evidence about the both safety and efficacy of the product. And then once a product's on the market, we face a lot less risk, a lot less uncertainty about what products we might want to use, and whether or not which products are best for which people. And so I was asked to talk about things in context of medical devices. So I figured it might be useful for everyone to do a very quick primer on medical device markets and as it relates to kind of this topic of innovation. So this slide here is, so this here is actually a defibrillator or pacemaker defibrillator, and it's an implantable one. And this is actually showing you a little bit about innovation here. Historically, you had something like this that was attached to your chest and had some lead that took it to the heart tissue. Now there's a tiny little leadless implantable thing here that is the whole thing in one tiny little package. And so, what does it take for a product like that to start to go to market and actually be implanted by physicians? So a lot of testing, starting with kind of bench testing, animal testing, early human tests, and some of that is very useful in ruling out things like materials that don't work in the body, short circuits, etc. But there's a lot of a lot of uncertainty and a lot of kind of efficacy questions in particular, or kind of safety questions related to rarer side effects or longer term side effects that can only be answered by doing pretty large scale trials and large scale human testing over time. And that testing might be some combination of voluntary by manufacturers or required by regulators. In general, we do not see a lot of voluntary testing beyond that that's actually required for these sort of products. Now, on the adoption side of things, for these medical technologies, like say a defibrillator, we're thinking about the cases where this is a physician, in this case a very specialized physician, who's going to be choosing among products and deciding whether or not to actually use these and implant these in a patient. And typically in both the EU and the US, the way these markets will work is that the payers will pay something for a procedure, and then either the payers or often the hospital actually will foot the bill for the technology, the device that's used in that procedure, as one of the costly inputs into that procedure, despite the fact that the physician is the one who's actually making the decision about what to use. And so there's really kind of two key features I want to accentuate here that are important to think about when you think about medical device markets here. And the first is that these are devices that are used by people, right? So something that really differentiates, I think, a device from most pharmaceutical products is that in the case of a surgeon implanting something, the effect you get from using this is not only the technology itself, but it's the surgeon using the technology in some sort of procedure. And this fact even goes for things like the Apple Watch that's here. But in a lot of the technologies, at least historically, that have led to a lot of the large sort of quality of life gains and increases in expenditures, these are things like the defibrillator here that are not like the Apple Watch, that are used by specialists. So these tend to be, the reason I accentuate that is because these will tend to be people who actually kind of understand the results from this testing. And I'll circle back at the end and think about the extent to what we know so far from these types of markets might extend to a lot of the new technologies that are more digitized and more consumer focused that are I think going to be a big part of medical innovation in, say, the next 10 to 20 years. The other thing to know is that there's a lot of variation in the evidence that's generated for different types of devices. So in the US, if you've seen John Oliver talk about this, for example, he talks about the segment of devices that don't see a lot of testing. And that's kind of a very interesting feature of the US market, is we have quite extensive testing for things like defibrillators and very little testing for other sorts of device products. The other kind of interesting thing I want to talk about, which will be most of what I talk about today, is that there's been a lot of differences across countries in how they've regulated different devices, even the exact same devices. And in particular, for high-risk devices like the defibrillator here, historically, the US and the EU have had very different approaches to regulation. So what I'm talking about here is some very recent reforms in the EU. Historically, sort of class 3 devices, so these are the highest risk devices where if something goes wrong with it, you're in bad shape. The US would require what's known as a pre-market approval by the FDA, and that's going to require some evidence on both safety and efficacy of the device. And usually we're talking kind of large scale phase 3 trials, a lot like a pharmaceutical product where you have hundreds, if not thousands, of patients and some sort of mortality or other clinical outcome that you're measuring at the end of the day. Versus the EU, historically, to get a CE mark from a notified body to get authorization to enter the EU, you'd have to prove safety and performance, which sounds a lot like safety and efficacy, but turns out to be interpreted quite differently in the sense of lots of trials to get access to the EU and a CE mark for the exact same product might be 50 patients or 100 patients, maybe even only a single arm trial with no control group, and so quite different from the US. And just to give you a more tangible example, a paper that Bob Town and I recently published looks at coronary stents for 10 years in the EU. And you can see here, just in the sample of products that we have in our data, the U.S. trial size is about 5 times the average trial size for a product in the EU, and there's more trials, and then this ends up mattering a lot for what products you see in the marketplace. So whether you look at the straight numbers that are market level or the numbers in parentheses there that are hospital level, you'll see about 4 to 5 times the number of manufacturers and products in the US relative to the EU. And you see a significant delay for entry into the US for the same products relative to entry in the EU. And so for stents, at least during this time period we study, what you see is the EU has a lot of products that just never enter the US. And even for those products that eventually enter the US, you're seeing about a 1.5 year lag, which basically means you're about a generation behind in this technology in the US relative to the EU. Now we kind of do some work trying to go beyond that, right? So this table kind of told us there's kind of action on both of these dimensions, right? So there's more clinical testing, and so potentially maybe there's less risk being faced by U.S. consumers in knowing about these products, but they're also waiting a lot longer and getting access to a smaller set of products. And so we do a bit of work in the paper to try and think about what actually is happening there, and it seems that the evidence really points to that EU physicians are actually learning from the US trial testing outcomes. So what you see when you look at product usage patterns in the EU for those products that are actually being tested for US approval, are things like, as US evidence is released, heterogeneity in usage patterns go down. So kind of volatility and uncertainty measures seem to go down. On average, products, as that volatility decreases, usage goes up. But you do see products when bad news comes out that usage goes down, right? And so we kind of first start with that descriptive evidence there, that there actually does seem to be some learning in the EU from the US, and then we try and think through the lens of a kind of more structural model about actually capturing this trade-off, right? So how do we actually measure what value is being created by that learning in terms of less risk being faced in choices in the market versus this cost in terms of both delay for extra testing, but also as testing costs increase, we might see a lot of that tail of products that actually enter the EU, these kind of smaller niche products actually not decide to actually forgo the cost of testing anymore. And kind of just to summarize the kind of headlines of what we find is that the baseline testing that the EU requires is actually quite important. In terms of the kind of heterogeneity across product qualities that we measure in the data is enough that if there were kind of no testing like the EU requires, there would be significant sort of a decrease in usage of products at all in the market. So this is kind of like you might think of as the chaos and confusion type of world that you'd be in. But the baseline testing the EU requires does avoid that scenario. That being said, the US testing levels, at least for coronary stents during this time period, seem to be closer to what kind of an optimal testing regime looks like. So EU testing is quite a bit lower than the optimal trade-off between risk and access, at least for these products during this time period. And the other thing that we look at that I find especially kind of an interesting thought experiment and a real relevant to real policy decisions being made right now is this idea of post-market surveillance. So the idea that by collecting evidence on what's happening even after a product is approved for use in the market, we can continue to revise what we know about a product and update that and kind of increase and decrease the risk while still having some level of access to a product. And we find that at least for this case that could improve welfare as much as 20%. So I think a big question about a study like this is, can we learn things more general than just for stents in a 10-year period from this study? And on one hand, the answer is it's difficult. On the other hand, what we do is kind of take this estimated model we have and start thinking through these same thought experiments and calculations for a pretty wide variety of parameters, that kind of depart from the ones that we've estimated. And the two really robust things that come out of that is, one, there is this value for sort of baseline levels of testing, kind of like the EU requires, right? So it's almost, kind of never optimal to decrease testing down to pre-market testing down to zero. And the two is this value of post-market surveillance. So the fact that thinking about collecting data even after a product is released to the market and continuing to decrease uncertainty and risk in that way can be really valuable, because the patients who, even when if you release a product with a fair amount of uncertainty, then it can still go to the patients who really need it most and don't have another good option, while we continue to learn about it for a broader population of people. And so, the actual numbers on values of these two things will depend a lot on the parameters, but the value of having them at all is pretty robust across different parameters. The other thing I want to talk about here briefly is actually what we've learned from the reforms that have happened in the EU. Interestingly, while we were writing this paper, the EU was contemplating some major reforms to their medical device regulations. I'm sure there's probably no causal story behind this, but actually very early stage results from our paper were presented by the head of the FDA when he went to talk to the EU back in 2014. So, no matter what we say about government processes, apparently it's faster than the economics publication process. But anyhow, so in 2017, the EU passed these pretty extensive revisions to their medical device regulations. And basically, they ended up looking a lot more like the US regulations for pre-market. So for most products now, the sort of trials you'll have to run to get access to the EU market look a lot more like the trials you'd have to run to get FDA approval, at least for these high-risk devices. And in some cases, even a tighter standard than what the FDA would require now. The other really interesting feature is both for old and new products. So if you're a product that's already on the market, you don't have to go do new tests. But the one thing you do have to do is implement a pretty rigorous post-market surveillance regime, right? And so this has been, it turned out to be, I think, maybe a bigger piece of the changes than people might have anticipated. The reason being is that the way they're orchestrating this right now, and the decisions seem to be being made, is that the cost of doing all this data collection are falling on firms. Now, I think, we always thought of the thought experiment as being, this is some sort of high fixed cost, but pretty low marginal cost infrastructure that maybe would be sort of, government run or run by, often in the US, when it's done, it's run by a consortium of firms. In this case, it seems to be that the costs are high enough that some smaller firms are starting to exit the market, which is kind of, I think, interesting and potentially worrying learning from what's going on in the EU right now. Now, what can we learn sort of more broadly, I think, from these two experiences and the kind of looking at the EU, both on the old EU and the new EU approach to regulating innovative new products. So I think, one is this one we talked about how it's really important to have some level of pre-market testing to avoid these sort of chaos and confusion scenarios. The thing I kind of point to there that I think is important as we move from these more specialized products into maybe more consumer-facing products is that understanding the results of this testing is a really important feature, right? When you have cardiologists who are interventional cardiologists who are kind of always looking at the new technologies and eager to adopt, maybe that's not a huge deal. When you have things like the Apple Watch here at the bottom, or COVID tests here, I think that's a much more salient issue, kind of tying in with some of the the last sessions, I think, discussions around consumer decision making. And so I think that's something that we'll need to think really hard about as we move forward with with getting more and more sort of home health, consumer facing devices into the market. The other is just this post-market surveillance thing makes a lot of sense, but I think we're going to have to be really careful about how we think about the costs of compliance and where those fall, right? So in particular, medical devices are full of lots of relatively small market, niche market products. And part of that has to do with just, how varied and fragmented the different use cases are for a medical device. But part of that also has to do with because getting back to this issue of they need to be used by physicians, changing what physicians actually do it tends to be a pretty long process, right? And so if you have a truly innovative product that's going to require physicians to start doing a new procedure that they've never done before, that's going to probably be a small market for a good number of years before something takes off, even if it has pretty enormous potential. And so I think these issues about costs to firms and when they're incurred as we think about regulation, I think is something we'll have to be careful about. And that's all I have. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Matt. Stayed right on time. Excellent. Well, let me turn over the mic to Amitabh Chandra here from Harvard University, talking to us about innovation in the drug sector, something we've already heard today from John Gruber earlier, but diving a little bit deeper. Amitabh, the floor is yours for 20 minutes here.
Awesome. Okay, so thank you for inviting me, John and Ben. As you know from my own work, I've not actually thought about the international perspectives on the topic that I'm talking about. So your conference gave me an opportunity to put some thoughts together. So I'm very grateful to you for that. So let me just start. I'm going to essentially show you 3 facts, and then I'll give you my interpretation of the 3 facts afterwards. But there are probably other interpretations of these 3 facts that we should definitely explore. The second thing is, I think there was this point that you raised, John, about how we want to think about patient cost sharing incentives for doctors on prescribing these drugs. I'm not going to talk about that in my slides, but happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. I'm really going to focus on innovation in the biopharma industry. And I'm going to start with a paper that comes from the Economics Journal that I think has been incredibly influential in Washington as Congress starts to think about this idea of tying U.S. prices to foreign prices. And this is this is just an amazing paper in the RAND Journal by Pierre Dubois, Oliver Mouzon, and Fiona Scott Morton. And I think the key there's many takeaways from this paper, but just to kind of one takeaway is their punchline number on how much revenue does a manufacturer need to see on average to produce one more drug. And I think of that number as being $2.5 billion. Now, just to note, and this is a number from their paper, they're not saying it costs $2.5 billion to bring a new drug to market. It might actually cost $2 to bring a new drug to market. But if you think about the problem that like VCs are facing around, looking at the discounted expected, the discounted expected NPV of an investment, well, then on average, you would need about $2.5 billion. And for some drugs, it's going to be a lot less. For some drugs, it's going to be a lot more. So if you were on with that $2.5 billion fact, one set of things you can start to do is to ask, well, what are the countries in the world that are capable of generating the market size necessary for the $2.5 billion? And I think one simple way to think about this is just what we saw with coronavirus. So if you think about March the 5th, March the 6th of 2020, there was still a sense in the US that maybe coronavirus would not come to the US. Maybe a quick shutdown would help. It really took the US and European markets to be infected. In other words, for the signal of market size to manufacturers to reach close to $6 billion. And then suddenly you saw, like literally 100 vaccine efforts underway. So it's not like we changed the science. It's not like we pumped a ton of money into basic science and virology. That science was sitting on the shelf. Come like March 2020, where like the market size has grown, it's large enough that this is worth allocating risk capital. There was no vaccine activity really in January Even though it was sort of raging through Wuhan and places like that, the only company that got involved in it was Moderna, and people thought they were a little bit crazy for thinking about COVID. So this is just sort of a quick illustration that market size affects innovation. Now let's just sort of think about the four big markets. The US market for drugs, if you count up all drugs here, so not just brand name drugs, generic drugs, drugs that are given in doctors' offices and in hospital settings, as well as retail drugs. The US market is a little less than $500 billion and is growing at about 5% a year. The top 5 countries in Europe have a market size of about 180 billion, and it's growing at about 4% a year. Japan is like, maybe a fifth of the US. And these emerging countries of Brazil, China, Russia, India account for, about 286 billion. So you can see that market, that worldwide market is about 1.2 trillion, but you can see from this little exhibit how large the US market is. It's just enormous compared to all the other markets. So a natural question becomes, how big are these other markets? Because if you're thinking about innovation, you want to know how much of the innovation is being pulled by the US market, induced by the US market, and how important are all these other markets, right? So like people say, well, China is not very high on per capita income relative to the US, but it's a lot of people. That's a really good point. Other people will say, well, the UK, the UK insures everybody. So even though it's a smaller population than the US and they have slightly lower income, it's not that much lower income, right? So let's kind of just look at market size across the world as a function of the US market and see what we get. So the current day is sort of 2018, and on the right is what you expect. So the US is mechanically 100% of itself. China, which is the next biggest market, is about a third as big as the US. And I'm not even getting into like, is this the market for oncology drugs or anything like that? But when we're thinking about other countries, other rich countries like Japan or Germany, they're actually quite small relative to the US, right? So if you're like an IO economist, you should be looking at this thinking, I understand now why there's tremendous, massive price discrimination across markets. Because these other markets, they could walk away from the drug, or they could threaten to walk away from the drug, and the manufacturer would be crazy not to offer them the drug at marginal cost or just a little bit over marginal cost. But what you can also see is if we started to tie our prices to the UK prices, right, just as an example, or the Spain prices or the Australian prices, well, manufacturers certainly are going to be like, maybe I just won't sell to Australia, because it's just such a small part of like the US market. It's 3% of the US market. It's like a small American state, right? And so I think we policymakers have to be very careful about sort of coming along and saying we're going to attach or determine American prices looking at some of these small, wealthy European countries like Belgium, because that would ignore the price response from manufacturers. It's going to be very easy for manufacturers just not to sell to Australia or just not to sell to Belgium, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. But the other thing to keep in mind is just the size of the US market. And I hope you're thinking now ahead to what that means for innovation. If you're a VC company doing innovation in biopharma, what you're going to be thinking about is that US market. It's not like you're not thinking about those other markets, but they're really just small. You're not thinking about, some price negotiation in Australia, some novel thing in Canada, because Canada is just way too small. Like VCs are not thinking about what the state of Kentucky is going to do, right? And some of these markets are smaller than the state of Kentucky, right? So let's talk about US innovation then. Here's what happened, right? Like this is what there's a challenge with sort of relying on the US then, because whatever the preferences of the US are for pharmaceutical innovation is what the whole world will get. And if you look at kind of all the drugs approved in 2017, half of those drugs were orphan drugs. So these are drugs for very, very, very small populations, right? And so on the right, I have an exhibit of the world's most expensive drug, Zolgensma. Zolgensma is a gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy. It retails for $2 million. Something like Luxturna, which is a gene therapy for inherited blindness. If you have both copies of the RPE65 gene mutated, you can take Luxturna and you can see, right? Well, the quality associated with sight is enormous. So Luxturna retails for $850,000. And where I'm going with this is, if you think about the first fact, which is that the US market is very big, or you think about my pre-fact that you need about $2.5 billion in revenue to induce this innovation, and a lot of that's going to come from the US market. Well, the US appetite for innovation tends to be in orphan drugs, and a lot of it actually tends to be in oncology. All the drugs that you see a 1 next to in those little circles, those are oncology drugs. So like a huge chunk of US innovation is geared towards oncology. In fact, if you look at every clinical trial out there, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and you look at what therapeutic area that clinical trial is in, what type of cancer, what type of cardiovascular disease, what type of neurology, what type of psychiatry, this is kind of what that map looks like today at a point in time. And you can see that it's skewed towards cancer. Cancer is incredibly important, but it's 15% of the disease burden. If you measure the disease burden as DALYs, sort of disability adjusted life years, cancer is 15% of the disease burden, 30% of the innovation. Mental health is a much larger share of the disease burden, but a much smaller piece of like where R&D is going. And so what is happening in the US, the signals that the United States market is sending biopharma manufacturers is exactly the innovation the rest of the world is going to get. So if the rest of the world is like, well, we would really like a drug for mental health, we're willing to pay a lot more, chances are you're not going to get it, right? Because they're just too small a country to really be able to induce that innovation. So I think this is important as we think about needing a large armamentarium of treatments against the next coronavirus and the next coronavirus and the next coronavirus. Like ultimately, the US market is going to have to start to think differently about its privileging of, say, oncology drugs relative to drugs that might treat infectious disease. And we'll come back to that theme in a little bit. I think another way to highlight this is the way I teach it to my students. Like, just think about these two very different diseases, right? Malaria, 216 cases last year alone, 700,000 deaths. Gout, it's like the opposite of malaria. You get gout by, eating salami, and you hang out and conferences in Europe with Ben Handel. That's how you get gout, right? So that's Henry VIII. That was his recipe for getting gout. And, no one really dies of gout. It's very painful. No doubt about the fact that it's painful, but like it's wealthy people who get gout. It's not poor people in sub-Saharan Africa who get gout. What's interesting about gout versus malaria is, just gout, just to kind of point out, like, why is it that there isn't innovation in malaria? It's because you would have to sell your great treatment for malaria to poor kids in sub-Saharan Africa. There's no market. You can't charge the poor kids in sub-Saharan Africa even $1. And so unsurprisingly, if you look at clinical trials for gout versus malaria, for malaria, you have the one clinical trial that Merck has been doing forever, but nothing really seems to come out of it. And in gout, you have about 20 clinical trials a year, right? That's all like the American market, the kind of the wealthy European market driving this innovation. So I think the first order issue for innovation is that the drugs that the world might want are unlikely to be the drugs that the world will get. The world will continue to get a ton of drugs that are geared for the US market simply because of its size. And the US market is big for 3 reasons. One, we're a big country, 330 million people. Second, we're a rich country, right? Relative to all the other countries, we're a very rich country. So high willingness to pay multiplied by lots of people. And third, no cost effectiveness. So like if you invent something very, very expensive that has a marginal improvement in outcomes, very marginal, we will cover it. So if you get very high willingness to pay multiplied by sort of no constraint on whether we're going to cover it or not. Medicare and Medicaid have to cover it regardless of, as soon as an FDA approval happens. And then you get a relatively rich country. You can see why the US market is so big. The other thing I want to talk about is sort of like, if you're talking about innovation, then where is the innovation happening? I'll just show you 3 slides on where the innovation worldwide is happening. So think about science. So I'm not talking about patents, but I'm happy to talk about patents. Think about a stage of innovation that precedes patents, which is just doing research in science journals. Let's look at basic science publications in top 7 journals, which are the BMJ, Cell, JAMA, Lancet, Nature, New England Journal, and Science. And let's look at the top 10 cities in the world that publish in these 7 journals. And in this graph, I'm only showing you basic science publications. What is basic science? Basic science is like papers that have nothing to do with disease. So it's like a paper about an isomer bond. It's a paper about anatomy, basic anatomy, not even of human beings, right? It could be about human beings, but it's just like, what is the anatomy of a particular limb in a mammal? It's about organisms. So like, it's about like, how does a virus infect a bacteria? And it's about phenomenon, like basic biological phenomenon. Like how does, the ribosome take an mRNA structure and produce something with it, right? So it's all about that. That's basic science. It's nothing to do with disease. You can see the incredibly important role of Boston and San Francisco and the Bay Area in this innovation. You can see New Haven in this. The point is, all the other American cities are not in the top 10. So if you look at a city like Houston or Nashville or Columbus, great American cities are not in the top 10. But the point I'm making here is no non-US city is in the top 10, right? Now, what about translational science? So this is science about diseases. It's not about necessarily treatments, but it's really about like, we're doing something in oncology, does it work? It's sort of the biology of the oncogene, right? That's translational science. And there again, you see no non-US city is present in the top 10. And then finally, you might say, well, what about clinical science? Clinical science is really like surgery, diagnostics, devices, imaging, right? Who's publishing in the top 10? No non-US city. So why is this? The reason is actually very, very simple. A ton of the VC money is going to these 10 cities, right? And I don't know if there's allocative inefficiency there. Like, you could look at this and say the VCs are just missing a bunch of really good science that's coming out of other cities around the world, like Tel Aviv does great science, London, Paris, Helsinki, they all do great science. The VCs don't think that that's where the great science is happening. They're investing in these cities, and you can see in green is biotech, in crimson is pharma, and then there's like all the other stuff that Matt was talking about that's equally important. And these cities soak up a lot of that kind of dollar flow as well. So it's not just that the U.S. kind of pulls this. All the push incentives from the NIH and all are clearly working in American laboratories and American universities. So like when we're thinking about worldwide innovation, even if we figured out how to create pull incentives in other countries, which, as my first chart showed you, would be hard to do, you'd still have to rely on these cities to sort of do it in some sense. It's not like these other cities would be able to suddenly, produce the basic science research it takes to, generate a new vaccine for coronavirus. And so my last topic, yeah.
Okay, 2 minutes quickly here around time.
Oh, let me just stop then and then wrap up. I'll give you,
I didn't take 3 or 4. I don't want to cut you off.
I'll come back to it. I think the punchline is that this is by far the largest market in the world. And so it will shape biopharma innovation for many, many years. I think that one problem with this is that what we get at the end of the day is guided by the US market. And when I say the US market, it's really the US commercial market. So it's like 160 million people who are very generously covered by their employers, whose health insurance benefits they receive on a tax preferred basis. That market is really, in some sense, the engine of innovation in this industry. But it has some huge social consequences. We're very unlikely to see big investments in tropical and infectious disease as a result of this market. I think that this, disproportionate role played by the US means a very large opportunity for price discrimination across countries, because it's going to be very easy for small countries to tell manufacturers that they're going to walk away. They could walk away. And because they could walk away, or they're willing to walk away, we're not willing to walk away. A lot of other countries are willing to walk away from medicines. They can get them at a much lower price. So you can see this appetite in the US, it's on both sides of the aisle, to be drawn to international reference pricing. I think some topics that have gone unstudied is just the quality of basic science research, and how much of a role that plays in the innovations that come to market. And then there's also just the role of, US risk capital markets in allocating that risk capital across the world. They appear to be allocating it disproportionately to American cities. On the one hand, there's some evidence that that allocation is efficient. Where the money goes is very much the same cities that are producing the very best papers. So the VCs appear to know that. On the other hand, you wonder if there's other innovations in other cities that the VCs may be missing. And I should just point out, for the graduate students in the room who are sort of interested in just finance, the quality of VC bets has largely been understudied. There's lots of reasons to think VCs get it right. This is this is capital markets, so that money can move very quickly. On the other hand, the funds, as you all know, take 10 years to pay out. Most of them don't pay out. Still, they're able to raise their next fund. I think we could do a lot more on characterizing the success of this industry. And then, I just wanted to make one point of clarification. Someone might misunderstand my comments. I'm not saying that what we've seen above is a good thing. I'm actually pointing out that some of that pull that happens in the US market is the consequence of a total lack of cost effectiveness, especially in Medicare and Medicaid. So there might be allocative inefficiency. We might be, quote unquote, investing too much relative to, say, putting the money into schools, or putting the money into infrastructure, or putting the money into some other thing we could do, like devices, than we are doing. So I'll stop over there. Thank you, John.
Great. No, thank you very much, Amitabh. That was incredibly insightful and opens up and starts to think about a lot of the key issues we're dealing with. Let me, there's a number of questions. Let me start with one that I think cuts across both of your talks. And it specifically, and the specific question to Matt is kind of, to what degree is the issues you identify with scale of trial a function of the EU countries doing some or all of this alone versus having a coordinating entity? And then I would zoom up and relate it to John Gruber's earlier comments that one big thing we might want to do more of is have the regulator involved in actually coordinating and conducting trials and post-market surveillance. I'll add that to put words in his mouth a little bit, particularly on the data collection side. How do you guys think about it? I mean, it's a theme in both of these that these even relatively wealthy countries are small, and maybe they would want to coordinate, or maybe, how do you think about this in both the lenses you're looking at?
Matt should take that.
I mean, I think at least, I think the government kind of funding of things can be, I think, helpful, but a little tricky. To the extent that market success is actually at least correlated in some way with quality. I think it's ex ante. It's a little hard sometimes, right, to know how to allocate. Like if government was significantly subsidizing clinical trials, for example, you kind of want the people who are going to gain from that to have some skin in the game, I think, in making that decision. I think one of the big challenges always that people talk about, I think, in both pharma and med tech is how much uncertainty there still is at the phase at which you have to make these significant investments. And that a lot of the kind of risk is really backloaded, right? Like you can, work on a device or a drug for, 10 or 20 years or something like that, until you figure out that it actually doesn't work. And so, so it's kind of interesting where you need to figure out some way to, fund these things, that's trying to incorporate whatever information and signals that there are, while still while still doing it in a way that incentivizes innovation and in areas that might be hard, or might be where the price signal isn't going to be big. Like malaria is just I think a great example of that, right? So this is where it seems like some of the things we've been talking about for the coronavirus, like trying to encourage pre-commitments to certain things, conditional on some types of levels of success, like those might be the sort of model that it's always been a little interesting to me that there aren't more sort of competitions held. Like it just seems kind of crazy to some level that the world hasn't banded together to offer a big pot of money for doing a good job of developing a malaria drug, for example. But they haven't.
Yeah, I'd love your thoughts on that, because actually that's very close to a question Ben asked, more in the context of also Me Too drugs. I mean, what is your view of the ability to have more kinds of pre-commitments that might, say, really reward things that are more breakthrough, where we'd obviously have to define that?
So I think of government as just being incapable of figuring this out, where markets, like there's just, as Matt said, there's so much failure, right? So the advantage government has in all of this is it has a lower cost of capital than financial markets because it's playing the long game. So government's going to use a 2% cost of capital. Financial markets will use a much higher cost of capital. So that's the discount rate. And so if you can discount things at 2%, that's awesome. On the other hand, think about the current coronavirus. This is not the first coronavirus to have hit the world. We've had SARS before. This is the reason this is SARS-CoV-2. That's because there was SARS-CoV-1, and there was MERS, and there were 7 Ebola cases. And of course, there was the great influenza of 1918. And there's swine flu. Now, let's think about what government has taken away from this. Has the government said, let's create a pre-commitment fund to avert the next coronavirus? Has any government in the world done that? I think Matt is exactly right. It wouldn't take a lot of money to actually do this. I mean, to build a vaccine for a coronavirus is not rocket science. Like we have you just have to kind of make sure that it works, right? So you cannot build it until the virus shows up. But you could have a lot of these things ready to go. You could find a way to sort of sequence all the coronaviruses that live inside bats, and you could be ready to go. You could have a platform that you can deploy very quickly. We haven't done that. It's not just our government. No government in the world has done that. So I think there's some general incompetence that government has when it comes to thinking about the future, which is very sad, because then we'll end up delegating all those market failure responsibilities to a man named Bill Gates. He is like he's single-handedly solving market failure in the world when it's really the job of government. If we can do this for coronaviruses, I think it would be great, because if we could do it for coronaviruses, which have now landed up at our doorstep, maybe we can start to think about malaria and West Nile, which we will see more of as a result of climate change. Like with climate change, there will be more malaria in America. There will be more West Nile in America. We're not prepared for that. So I worry a lot that what we're very good at doing in government is letting the private sector do all the R&D, then in phase 3 coming along and saying, we'll subsidize your R&D. Sadly, that was not the R&D that needed to be subsidized. You don't need a company to get its phase 3 R&D subsidized. You need the basic science like 2 decades ago to be subsidized. So, can we do it? Yeah. Will we do it? I would be very surprised. I have not seen any sensible Democrat propose a concrete plan to do this for COVID-3.
So one other question, sort of somewhat related to this anyway, and Amitabh, I think it's interesting you pose sort of that the U.S. preferences are being exported in a massive way here, and there's 2 related questions there that I think you bring up. One is, I want your views on, and this is both the VCs that might fund this, but also the managers within the pharma companies. Might we be concerned that they actually care very little about the aggregate financial returns of their decisions and much more about, different things, career concerns, promotions, not wanting to fail? Most of them, as we're saying, almost all of them will have been retired or moved to another company by the time this bet would pay off. And I'm interested in how you think about that. Another related set of sort of preferences that might be going through the system is that health insurers, right? You talked about the mental health drugs. Well, partly it's that health insurers have not covered them for a variety of reasons that are outside, arguably outside of the nature of acuity or nature of morbidity of the diseases, and largely a function of adverse selection and kind of the stigmatization of the diseases that allowed them really to not cover them without regulation. Kind of how do you view insurer coverage as also manifesting itself in where innovation goes? And this, I guess, would also relate to these kinds of, COVID-2, coronavirus, or even other communicable diseases where insurance arguably is always going to undercover it because of the private coverage consumptions or coverage will be low. It's a lot there, but
so I think on the mental health and the insurer lack of demand, you're right, John, but that's a lot of it has to do with this point that I was trying to make, that the demand is coming from the US commercial market. And the US commercial market cares a lot about Luxturna and Zolgensma and the new oncology drugs and, breakthrough technologies for diabetes, which would, of course, spill over onto the whole world. But mental health, it's important, but it's not that important to that market. And so you got to beef up the willingness to pay for novel, game-changing drugs that can go after mental health from Medicaid. Medicaid is a big payer, but Medicaid is a relatively poor payer. And so I think we're just seeing that market size point that I started with come alive even within the US. So just like the Australian market isn't doing anything for drug innovation, Medicaid is probably not doing as much because it's a relatively poor payer and it's unconstrained. Look, now if you give me the mic for forever, I'll end up saying that we should just be raising taxes, which is something I've always argued for, because if Medicaid had more money, which I think we're a rich country, we could give Medicaid more money by just I think innovation and tax policy are sort of linked at some level because there's a whole bunch of missing medicines that don't come to market, not because the science isn't there, but because of your point, John, that Medicaid is unable to pay for them, but it would naturally pay for them. A novel schizophrenia drug would really benefit Medicaid. Let's expand Medicaid, and if it costs us money, let's tax people to expand Medicaid, right? Yeah, the malaria problem is a different problem, though, just to be clear. Like the malaria problem is I think anytime you're dealing with COVID-2, malaria, you're dealing with infectious disease, and that's a classic market failure because the willingness to pay is really small and manufacturers really don't capture the full willingness. So there we got to think about Matt's ideas around pre-commitment contracts.
Great.